Anil, is it more coming through? Can you check it more?
I'll check.
Okay.
Reception starts at 7.
Right. I expected a few more minutes to walk through the door. This is the latter part of the day, first day, part of the conference. Last year, we had key players in the industry to share their leadership style and aspiration, how they got there. And I think it was Tony Hayward, who was past, BP CEO. And I think he had 45 minutes to 1 hour with us in terms of his journey so far. This year, I was mindful that how do we follow that up? Rather than looking outside, I decided to look inside and trying to find who is our hero that is actually hidden there, that we need to tap in and see whether we can find pearl of wisdom and knowledge from. And it's not rocket science to see why you got Chris Cole sitting there. So my job, this is going to be very difficult because I'm speaking to my ex-boss and always my boss. My job this afternoon is quite interesting. I intend to tackle this instead of 4 stages. Stage 1 really is just to set the scene, just to understand where we are. And Chris won't be doing that, I'll be doing it. The second stage really for me is to open up with a few questions with Chris in terms of how did he get there? And it's easy, to say this thing is, it's easy. And the third stage really would be a lot of opportunity for Q&A from the floor. And so sharpen your pencil, but be kind to Chris in the sense that I'm just told that he flew in from New York this morning. And rather than doing what most of us do, which is go and have a kip, he went straight to the office and he's here fresh, willing to give us 45 minutes of his time. And then I probably want to close out with some, observation and closing points, about 4 stages, to keep it going. And thereafter, I'll give you feedback as to how we get to ICE, which is the final part of this first day. So for those who doesn't know a lot about WSP, I'm not here to do a pitch, but actually it's a company that has heritage that is actually, going back from what I understand from, a team of 3 that have grown a global business. Some slide here, these are corporate. And I don't expect Chris to talk about this, but I just want to flip through this line. It gives you some, headline of strategy of where they are and the global footprint in terms of what they do and our aspiration. But I'm looking at you from today in terms of, what drives him? How does the company get to where it is, And really, as an organization, how does he drive that company to where it is? A lot of questions being put to Chris in terms of, what is the aspiration and what is the size and all of that. And if you have those questions, keep it to yourself because you have an opportunity to ask him later on, and he will do his best to answer that. When you look at the size of the organization now, globally, it's self-evident. And it's not about size, it's not about, what makes you unique, it's about really how do you get to that stage and how do you sustain that and how do you keep that going. So with that sort of, background information about what the organization do and the spread of the organization, it leads me to the point I thought, I should start off by saying, Chris, thank you very much for giving us the time. You and I have spoken about this, and the journey that I want to travel with you for the next 35, 40 minutes. I promise to, to touch on what I think will be appropriate, but more important, to give the audience an opportunity for them to ask questions, which is not a difficult question, but a question that they would love to ask you. In a way that you can actually help them to shape their direction of travel. So without further ado, I'm going to move across from here and sit with Chris, if he allows me to do that, and say, Chris, thank you very much for giving us the time. I'm not going to be Jeremy Paxman or try to do what I'm not trained to do. It's an interesting journey, hasn't it? What was the main driver? Is it family? How do you get into the engineering profession? Is there anything in the DNA, or is it just, some of us get fascinated? How do you get into the engineering?
The first point is, that's what I was, and I suppose loosely I still am an engineer. I How did I find my way into it? I had a father who was an aeronautical engineer that spent 2 years in it and got taken off to war. And when he came back, there wasn't a job, so he went into the family business, but he always harboured then an interest and sort of a dormant passion for engineering. Even though he studied to be one, he performed for a couple of years, and then the war got in the way. And so he had I think he had a quiet ambition for both his sons to be engineers. But it was quiet, and I was typically a person that didn't quite know what direction to go in. So engineering seemed a good idea because my dad said so. And the only criteria that I put out at the time when I decided to search for what I was going to do was I didn't really want to get my hands too dirty or greasy. So I needed to find an engineering profession that I could perform in and develop in and not get too dirty or cold. And I found myself into the design side of the buildings world many years ago. So, and I was fortunate, and I think sometimes I wish it was planned, but I was fortunate to join a large contractor in those days who was prepared to educate me for 5 years through what we used to call sandwich courses, which are becoming quite popular again now. Is
that the same as what we now call apprentice approach?
I was a student apprentice, that's what I was. And I was, because I tried quite hard and showed some drive, they were prepared to invest in me. And at the end of 5 years, I came out with something at the end, and I wasn't without some knowledge and acumen on business in the very loosest sense, or engineering in the loosest sense. So that's how I came to find myself in the profession. It wasn't something at the time that I was driven from any particular age. I've got to be that. It was I found myself leaning towards it, and that's what I did. That's why now when I talk to people, I'm not particularly vocationally driven. When I used to talk to my son, when I talk to friends, sons and daughters, I'm not a believer in vocational direction. If you don't have it, it's not a problem. You'll find it.
Was there a particular hero apart from your dad who happens to be an engineer in the aeronautic? Was there any hero in the industry?
Pardon?
Was there any hero, a key person that
no.
That you look up to?
No, my heroes then were usually footballers and people like that. There was no. I didn't have any heroes in that regard. So there's no pretending that I had this amazingly vocational direction. I didn't. But when I got into it, clearly I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being an engineer in the early days. I enjoyed the engagement with. One thing about it was, there was two things really. One, you engage with a lot of people, both inside and outside your company. So you were really always engaging with people and teams. That was a huge plus. I really enjoyed that. At a very young age, going and sitting in other offices and talking about projects with teams. I mean, that was, my friends were stuck in offices as accountants and bankers and never saw anything. And so I was quite pleased about that, and I didn't work it out. That's how it was. And I enjoyed engineering at the time through that part, because of course it was tangible.
So when you left the initial training program, what was the attraction? I mean, how do you take a decision as to which side of the engineering you want to be in?
Well, I didn't have a choice. I found myself in mechanical engineering from the beginning. So I was a poor mechanical engineer, that's what I did. I did mechanical services, and that's what I was loosely called at the time. Environmental or other ones like MEP or whatever, but the reality was I was a mechanical engineer designing mechanical services, and that's how I started.
Now, something tells me that the mechanical engineer or the M&E or whatever the branded name tend to be these days, that was the genesis of WSP. So how do you get into WSP?
Well, I mentioned I was fortunate to be with a large contractor that educated me, and then I was pretty disloyal because I left quite soon afterwards to better myself. I made one move to another contractor, which was very educational because I found myself quite lonely, but had to survive, and that was quite good for me. And then I made that decision at a young age that I perhaps would prefer to be a consultant. And the consultancy industry at that time was emerging quite rapidly. You've got to remember, contractors have been around for
ages,
a lot longer in terms of real scale. And so I actually moved to Atkins because I just literally almost went down the yellow pages and I thought, who would I like to work for and who's close to home?
Okay.
And Atkins ticked a box, and I got a job there. But it didn't last very long.
Is it just the environment or just the eagerness for you to do what you want to be?
My impatience and their pedestrianism. Sort of culture really at the time, and the two didn't really get on very well. And I had the opportunity when I was 28, I think, something like that. Sounds young now.
Just relatively young.
Yeah, about 28. I had the opportunity to do a startup with somebody.
And were you persuaded, or it just seems natural? Or
no,
just
I was unhappy. I was not. I clearly Atkins wasn't going to work for me personally. I mean, you've got to remember, even in all those years ago, it was a great company. It was a big company. It was a various, but it just didn't suit me. Apart from it had a good tennis courts, and it was quite local to where I lived. It didn't it didn't suit me very well at Epsom. Yeah.
So in '75 was the WSP.
74-ish. I parted company with them and went into a startup with a guy who, well, I suppose I had the energy and he had the money.
Okay, yes. A good blend.
And he'd had a legacy, and he was 23 years older than me. I think it was 24 years older than me, and he had some money, and he was relatively lazy, but quite astute.
You had the energy.
And I had the energy. And the only thing that I did, probably unknowingly, was I remember signing my house against the bank facility.
That's a lot of risk.
At the time, and I thought, subsequently, I remember my wife signing it, and she didn't, to this day she didn't know what she signed. But that's how it started.
So you've always been the risky business.
So. Well, yeah, I can assure you at 28, risk is very different than when at a later age. There's no doubt. You see more risk as you get older than you do when you're young. That is for sure. It doesn't mean you don't take it, but you analyse it more when you're older. When you're younger, you just go for it. You don't even think about the risk. You just think about the opportunity. We didn't have risk registers in those days, so I found myself in a startup, and I can remember there being 4 of us plus a part-time secretary. That was how many there was in 2 rooms. So anything can be achieved. Anything can be, and that was in 1974.
So from the startup, you had an equity in the business from day one.
Yeah, a little tiny bit.
But it's good enough. It's good enough.
Just remember, equity when you're young sounds quite good. Whether it's worth anything at that point is another matter. But yeah, I had a small equity at that time, but it was more emotionally pleasing than anything else. And the journey started then in '74. Well,
I mean, I have some data at the back of my mind, and Chris, I'm sure you're going to help me, as best as you can. So that initiative kick-started in '74, '75 with 3-4 of you. And how does that move on to become from a small gathering into effectively a listed company? Can you share your journey on that? That's quite interesting.
I'll keep it short because I could talk for England on it. Fundamentally, the business started to grow as any business does. If it's successful and does all the right things, it will grow. It's just a question of how quickly, which is partly dependent upon markets. But within within 7 or 8 years of it starting, I again became impatient for us to grow faster. I became impatient for us to be considering skills beyond mechanical and electrical, because that's what we did. And kind of a very long story short, I also had then 2 partners. There were 3 of us then. I had increased my equity a bit, so I'd done worked at it a bit, but there were 3 partners by then. But the senior partner, some of you may be able to resonate with the whole issue of equity in businesses, equity in partnerships. They can create quite a lot of tension, and it created tension for me early on, and that tension grew over 2 or 3 years, and by that time, we'd grown to about 150 people, not particularly big, but it was a real business by then, and that's still doing the same things. We didn't even have a London office. We were out of London, and
was it still an M&E business at that time?
That's all it was. That's all it was. We were pretty proud of it, but I didn't. Every year, the ambition to do more than that and to play on a wider landscape just grew. In fact, it ate away at me a bit, because I didn't always like being an M&E engineer when other people around the table thought they were more professional. It ate away at me a bit, and I was introduced to I made a lot of inquiries what I could do. And you've got to remember, things like private equity weren't particularly available at that time, and not in a way they are now. Not that I'm saying I would have gone that route, but the reality is there were a limited number of options. But one of the options available at that time in the late 80s was to float the company on the stock exchange.
What was the rationale? Is it just pure to grow or to get capital into it?
To get my partner out and pay him off.
Okay.
It was a way to solve the equity problem, not just on that day, but forevermore.
Okay.
And believe me, by that time, I wanted to solve it forevermore, because I didn't want anyone else to have the same problem. Because it can eat away at you. It can be quite negative
and emotion as well.
And also I was so keen to grow the business faster. And we all know one of the things that you need to grow a business faster is money.
Money, yes, absolutely.
You need working capital. And we never had, it was a private business, there's limitations on it. And so by becoming a public company, which at that time was pretty unusual. If you go back to 1987, you will not find many professional services businesses that had gone or even thought about going public. There's one over there, sitting there, whose legacy came from about the same time. But there weren't many. And I soon learned that by being a public company, I had access to capital. Okay. And within a year, we'd bought our first business by using our position, our capital, our equity. And so whilst the organic growth continued, always continued, and always must continue, one started to acquire our first business. The first business I acquired was in the UK and in Newcastle, and I think the box at Newcastle United was probably a better asset than the business on a bad day. But that it was the beginning of a journey where we could start to think about acquiring, and immediately you can acquire, and if you really are driven to be a larger business, it just opened up an amazing landscape of opportunities, because we wanted to be an engineer of every discipline. We wanted to be beyond an engineer. It wasn't long before we wanted to be an environmental outfit. We wanted to be lots of things, and over the next few years, one began to embrace those other disciplines quite quickly, not without their challenges, but quite quickly. But there was a recession, and looking around the room, some of you remember it, there was a recession in the early 90s. in this country, and it was particularly a private sector recession, and we were very much a private sector facing business then. That was what I was, and the recession hurt us quite a lot because we had nowhere to run. The private sector was being beaten up in the UK. We were a private sector facing business in the UK. So it was quite a tough time, and it just taught me, from my perspective, it meant if I want to be part of growing a great business, and I want to have people with me on the journey who are safe and secure in that growth, we can't rely on one economy for it. And it is so true. It was after '93, after we came out of that recession, I started to go internationally, and WSP started to buy businesses internationally as well as at home in the UK. And it was they were both happening simultaneously.
So is business diversification and footprint diversification, that was a real driver. And
it's just interesting to reflect on. We sit down for days and do strategy plans, and everyone's better at drawing them up and not so good at executing them often. But the reality is that that was a big decision when I look back at the time. Here we were, probably 500 people in the UK without any real work outside the odd project, but not a lot, but no destinations and no critical mass, and from 93 to 80, we grew. 93 to 2000, we grew internationally, and in this country we just diversified. So we covered as many. So diversification is my byword, and that's it.
So
it
diversification and geographical, spread as well.
Yeah.
Was there any particular company out there that you see that you think WSP could be like, or that you aspire to? Whether they're still on or not, doesn't matter. Was there a particular company at that time, or a number of companies that you think potentially this is what WSP could look like in the future, or you admire?
Well, there was at the time we floated, because the story I can tell you is that when I stood up to float, when we floated the business, and we were selling a proportion of our stock to the market, you're selling. That's all you're selling. A trust and a bit of a dream. And I said at that time that Arabs was a pretty good model that we would like to be. Bearing in mind at the time we were a few hundred and they were many thousands. And they were, at that time, what WSP, with me and my colleagues, we used as a bit of a model. I mean, to be fair, it changes through life. But at that point in time, I don't think since then I've ever felt like that. Since then, I've never looked at anybody and say I want to be like them. I think all of us at WSP have much more been independently driving the business for what we think is right for WSP. But at that moment in time, that was a pretty good standard bearer. Well,
I mean, it's interesting you raised that. I mean, we spent a lot of time earlier on today talking about merger and acquisition, and it's on record that WSP, pretty, you've combined it very well, both organic and acquisitive strategy. Which one was a game changer for you? Which one was it? You've done quite a lot. At what point do you think this is a game changer? Was it your internationalization or the size? Which one was it?
You told me you'd ask me that.
I did say that.
And you also said, was it? That's right. Are you an M&A player by planned or by accident?
Accident. Yeah, I did ask the question.
It was planned? It was planned. Nothing was by accident. But I can pick great acquisitions, but I can pick acquisitions that actually weren't that good, but they brought a couple of great people.
Okay.
It's funny, we tend to measure the success of an acquisition by the spreadsheet, by the P&L that we get from it. That's how we tend to measure it. What we don't ever measure are the intangible benefits of some great people you might get that give you then an avenue into projects that you may you take for granted a few years later, but you wouldn't have been there without them. I mean, when I travelled to New York, having come back from there today, it reminds me when I travelled there to look for businesses to acquire, because the Americans were coming to London, as you remember, in the 90s, doing all our work. And so
you went home
it seemed a good idea for us to go to America and you know, it was really tough for a British company at that time to buy in America. You were just, everyone said, oh, you'll be a shipwreck. And we weren't a shipwreck because we put so much time and effort into it. We didn't just buy it and leave it. And but you think I bought WSP bought a relatively small structural engineer. There's a lot of people in this room are engineers. I bought a relatively modest structural engineer that had a great CV, probably in the top 3 in the world. And how, if you just look at the projects across the world that WSP do in the high-rise arena now, it is unbelievable. And that seed all started because one found some great people with a great CV in New York.
Tall building.
And to this day, they're still there. One of them got his 45-year award last Friday. Wow. And he's 80, and he's still full-time. And he still delivers projects, and he's still got clients, because the clients live a long time as well. You know, so picking out great acquisitions is impossible to do, because they all take you to a different place. They make you a multidisciplinary from a single discipline. They then make you go into adjacencies. They then take you into geographies or new sectors. And that's all I kept wanting to do. Wanting to just spread the branches of that tree to make us as diversified as possible. And there's no doubt, when you look back, some of them were spread too far. You know, some of them we went into places, but that's hindsight. I mean, you know, we bought into South Africa. Post-apartheid, it was fantastic. It was great. We had a great 20 years there. You wouldn't go there now if you had your white piece of paper and you were planning your business. You probably wouldn't be there. But that's how it is.
Chris, you've talked eloquently about your move in terms of moving North America, which is taking it home to them. Then you did Europe, or you did Africa. And looking through the growth of the organization, at a point in time, you've had some challenges. And like any great leader, you respond to those challenges. You talk about the 1990s, there was the issue about the financial meltdown. More recently, there's the 2011. Are there particular, those milestones in the journey so far that was quite challenging for you, and how do you deal with that? Because we know you dealt with it. It's just how to sort of overcome those challenges and move on.
No, well, I mean, it's all the people that deal with it. I mean, it's all the people that deal with it. I mean, it's them believing that you're going to come out the other side fitter and better than you went in, even if you have to make some tough decisions on that journey. But it's the culture of any business that takes you through running a business in good times is not particularly difficult. It's just a question of how good you do it. Running a business in challenging markets is definitely, it may only be the reciprocal. Down is the reciprocal of up, but the challenge is to keep everybody engaged, motivated, absolutely in a great place is much harder.
Well, it's interesting, because that leads me to the next question I was going to ask you, which I'm sure you are aware of this. I mean, in my time in WSP, you always banged the drum about clients and staff and share and stakeholders. Those guiding principles in terms of getting close to your client, taking ownership of your staff and actually being close to them, are they still the same principle, and does that still drive?
I stand back and watch now. I mean, I don't. I mean, we're a big company with a lot of very senior people. We have a headquarters in Montreal. But when I stand back and I look at the business, and I read the material and I listen to the conversations and commentaries, the big conference a couple of weeks ago, those guiding principles, those values are still there. And the day they aren't is the day the company will probably falter on its journey. But those fundamental guiding principles are still there, and the leadership of the group, they know.
One thing that always attracts me, and that I find very stimulating as a leader, is watching your journey so far, Chris, and mine is nowhere in any comparison, is the intervention of the Canadian and how you manage to have WSP to become a Canadian-owned entity, yet become the chair. And now I understand you speak French, very well. So my French colleagues around there probably will test that. But you do cross over.
I need a script, and I need it written. I need it written phonetically. So
you made the move in a difficult time and get the Canadian involved with the business, and you are still at top of the helm of that business.
Well, yeah. That's because I haven't found anybody else. No, I mean, as I say, those guiding principles don't change. And I mean, making that decision, taking WSP into Canada and being acquired by a company half our size that was singularly Canadian while we were in probably 35, 40 countries. So we may not have been a global company, but we were certainly an international company, and we were 11,000 people, and they were 5,000 people.
The size is...
So the size was different, the culture in terms of international reach and experience was different. But I believe in consolidation. I mean, I've been on the consolidation journey for 25 plus years, and I've completely committed to it. Was committed in 1987 when I went public, because that was one of the reasons, and I've never wavered from that commitment, and it's still there now. And so I found, but in that period of, you talk about difficult times, 08, 09, 010, there's not many people here that didn't find that period pretty challenging. Maybe the most challenging of their careers. And I still wanted to consolidate, but we didn't have the, for the first time ever, the banks weren't particularly supportive. The share price wasn't as rich or healthy as it had been, so it was difficult. And if you're a consolidator and if you're used to change, as we were as a group of people, for a while when you go into recession, you're just pleased to get through that year, and if you don't go backwards, that's success. Flat was good for a couple of years. I mean, imagine saying flat is good, but it was for a couple of years. But then it's not so good actually. You need to do something about it. So so one thought about how one could reverse the situation. How could we still consolidate, but with somebody else's money? And of course, Canada escaped the recession because their banks were sensible prior it. They were cautious. They had a wealth of oil at the time and minerals. So Canada had a wealth that in 2011, you couldn't believe. We were fighting, to make a margin. Life was still tough. 10, 11. Canada were knocking it out the park, and they had access to amazing funds, of which they still do today. They have access to pension funds that are just so significant. I mean, the Quebec pension fund is in the top 6 in the world. The Quebec, Le Caisse de Paris, top 6 in the world, and it's Quebec money. I mean, a province in North America. And so I started to look around at who might we join in a reverse way, and who might we... There's no point joining someone who's going to be a bit stuck for cash like we were. That was no point of that at all. I didn't want to be consumed by somebody that would just consume us. That was something. So I found this other route, and it's worked brilliantly. I mean, it's worked brilliantly for the people in WSP. The opportunities they've had, the scale of the business, because growth provides opportunity for people. If you don't get growth, how do you find spaces for great people? And it's worked very well,
Yeah.
but it's 5.5 years on now since we did the deal, and therefore it's sort of 7 years since I was talking.
And it's gone from 16,000 in that combination to 40,000 or 41,000.
41,200, I was told yesterday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chris, I'm going to change the sort of conversation a little bit, which I think is important. Every great leader have to find something that enable them to distress. What do you do in your sort of leisure time?
Oh, I'm a terrible example.
Yeah.
Don't come to me for conversation on building a business. Come to me for conversation about clients, but don't come to me for conversation about lifestyle balance, because I'm not the best advisor in the world.
But you're involved
And I'm
with
certainly
sports.
I'm certainly not the best example. That's why the sport I do is very precious to me.
I know.
Because apart from that, I work. So I play tennis and I cycle.
So in cycling and tennis, is there any particular hero, anybody there that?
Yeah, he was playing in Glasgow on Tuesday in a kilt. His name's Federer. My other hero was Lance Armstrong, of
That's
course.
right. Yes.
If you read the book, it's all about the bike. You'd know why he's a hero. Then if you ever want to read a book that's motivational, read that book. And I don't read a lot of books, but read that book. It's not about the bike, and it's just quite something. Obviously, sport by events later, but there again, if they were all doing it, he was still the best at doing it.
Yeah. Good. I'll come back to the youth. I remember my time in WSP, and I believe it's still on. There's something that was called Task Force, which you set up, which is about young people, how you inspire them, get them involved. And in ACE, we've got Progress Network. In FIDIC, there's Young Professional Engineer. What was the drive for that? And has he actually, to deliver what you expected from it? Because I've seen quite a lot of people that went through that in the life of WSP and move on to
it started at about, there's a guy over there that was, I think, in the first one.
Is it just, Tom
He's as old as that. And that was about 1994 or 5. We started a young, junior board. And we were big enough to do it. I mean, scale gives you all sorts of opportunities to do things. And two things drove it, really. One was just a passion for young people. I used to really upset me when people left in those days. It was a passion to keep young people. It was a passion to give them, the more I could be engaged with them, the more I could stay sort of half young, but relatively, I did have a passion for young people in that way, and also I never had that opportunity. When you build a business, you miss out on things. It may be a great journey, but when you're building a business from a couple of people to 20 to 40, a lot of you will know 40, 60, 80, 100, 500,000. You don't actually get the opportunity yourself to enjoy.
So it's a means of you getting back to it.
Being said, you're on a junior board of this company of so many thousand people. You're going to report to the main board. We're going to give you 2 or 3 subjects a year to come and report on. That would be quite nice, isn't it? It's quite nice projects to do. I never got that. When you're building a business, you don't get any of that. You're still doing the bloody drawings and putting the stamps on the post. And so it was really. I felt a bit shortchanged, so I wanted to want to do it for other people.
Well, I mean, the feedback I get is, apart from you getting the gratification to do things you didn't do because you were building the business, is you've got product that came out of that. Tom is on the far end there, Global Director for building properties. I met Mark Naismith, who is now your UK MD, managing nearly 7,000 people. You've seen a lot of people in that apprentice process.
Oh, well, we have HR talking for ages on talent management and producing everything on talent management, and we all do so much more than we did 10 and 20 years ago, so much more. But actually, that was talent management in its infancy. That was really doing it all those years ago, and though we didn't call it that.
But that was what it was.
But it's what it was, and some of those people have grown to be the most important people in WSP worldwide. Because as we started one in the UK, then we started one in other countries. As the countries got critical mass, so we started the same thing. And you end up with one in every major region in the world, and they connect.
But they do connect.
They connect, and those people are with us. And the ones that have left, and some leave, because one of the problems with it is you create an aspiration, and you can't always when they come off that sort of environment, they want to not rule the world, but they want to be, they want to do things different. They don't want to go back to the same manager they were working for and do the same stuff. They want to do more. So managing aspiration or being able to accommodate it is quite difficult. So we lost people actually because of those talent management schemes. But I think when you get to a certain size, you accept that you educate people for your company, but you educate people for the industry as well. It's just a mutual dynamic.
Chris, you touched on the issue about industry. I thought it was appropriate to make a link on that. A man of your status with the busy portfolio that you have, rarely have time for industry, but yet you got involved with ACE. I wouldn't say it's because of Nelson, but more
probably was.
But more in terms of making something contribution to the industry. You also participated in FIDIC. We have FIDIC president sitting in there. Do you feel that the direction of travel of the representative body, that leaders need to take more input? And how do you think those sort of industry representation should focus in future? What will be your advice?
Make the chair of ACE 2 years, not 1.
Okay.
Make them probably more accountable for delivery, because I suggested lots of nice things and we talked, but I wasn't held to account at the end of a year to deliver it.
Yeah, but you had a CEO who had to deliver. He's paid to do that.
But I didn't hold you account to it always.
You did hold me account to it.
So I think the associations, institutions, professional bodies need to reinvent themselves businesses are reinventing themselves every so many years, sometimes prompted by a recession, sometimes prompted by a major acquisition. When we acquired Parsons Brinckerhoff, I mean, we took on 14,000 people. That was quite a lot of people to absorb into a company. So you have to reinvent yourself. Otherwise, how else can you absorb that sort of number of people and make them feel part of everything and just become a greater business than you were, which I believe we achieved very well. But you have to reinvent yourself, and associations, professional bodies have to reinvent themselves, and I think they're not good at that. I think they're good at doing more of the same. And I think the other problem is, and we had the biggest conversation we had when I was the chair of the ACE was revenue. Revenue. Are you just going to rely on membership revenue and just be, different? It's a bit like running a club, and if the memberships cover everything, you don't have to worry if the meals are not very good. And finding a route to increase the revenue is probably the subject we talked about most when I was chair, because I believe that it's a commercial world, and you have to find ways of engagement such that it brings in revenue.
The next question I was going to put to you, Chris, is that a lot of you people, and including myself up until recently, only know you about WSP. But I do know, and through my research, that you do have involvement and you chair a number of companies. Some of them are FTSE 100 doing close to 5 billion. How do you manage to run the WSP being the chair?
By having a crap lifestyle.
I mean, you are in a sort of, big, FTSE 100. You are in a Spanish consultancy business as chair. You are in another technology company as non-executive chair. How do you combine all of those things?
Having a good PA that manages your diary.
I know her very well.
it's part of being driven. I mean, I don't have to do it, but I enjoy it. I really still enjoy learning from other companies and other people, and I'd recommend anybody who, at a point in their career, to involve themselves in a second company at least, because otherwise you look in the mirror every morning and guess what? You see the same thing. And so I'm a real advocate of the corporate governance of having big on another board. Really do. From my point of view, it's just it's being prepared to give up a lot of time, enjoying it and being driven to do it. And I mean, I chair a FTSE 50 company, which is pretty challenging. We've grown it from. I've been with it for a number of years. It was the one I took when I decided I wanted to know something else about life other than WSP. I took a non-executive appointment to find out a bit about the world outside WSP. And this particular company has grown now to be a FTSE 50. And to put it in context, to make you, and I say this because I say it with huge pride, and I'm only the non-exec chairman. When I took it over as a chairman, the shares were 28p. Yesterday they were £19.35. Work that out as what it means. It's huge. And that's just because, what did I do? I recruited the right CEO. If the chairman just does that, he's probably earned his presence at the board. But that's a sort of growth. I mean, and a £9 billion company from one that was hundreds of millions. So if you're driven and you've got, there's no magic formula, but it works. We're just people. We rely on people. Every business has people, some more than others, but the more you can, how could WSP have grown without great people? Well, not a chance. I see autocratic businesses occasionally. I see autocratic businesses where they're great for one generation. One generation they're great for because they've got a great leader. And they grow as big as that leader can stretch their arms. And when that leader goes, the business, the brand hangs on, but the business goes down. And there's so many in our space that you can describe like that. So many consultants that were strong and powerful 20 years ago, and now they're not. And I'm passionate about single generation businesses. Well, I'm passionate about not single generation businesses. I'm passionate about the fact that you've got to go, and it doesn't matter whether it's a family. I mean, I currently work with a family business of some scale, as purely as an advisor to the board, and it literally is a family business where every share is owned by the family, and it's a few billion euro business, so it's quite big, and it's owned 100% by the family, and the chief exec and chairman is 77, and the sons and daughters are in the business, but managing succession is difficult enough, as we all know. Truly managing succession through the generations is really tough. People talk about it as just another tick in the box, succession planning. To do it properly and well I think, it's really hard. And to do it in a family business is even harder because you're usually got succession planning of the business and a succession planning of the wealth.
Chris, I've got nearly 20 minutes and I thought I should give the floor a few opportunity. Because I've covered quite a lot and I'd like to come back if time permits. There is somebody at the far end there, there's Patricia there, and I've got the prof from